They say travel can change your life, but I never expected how true that would be until I went to Egypt. At 22, I embarked on what I thought would be a simple adventure to the land of pharaohs, pyramids, and ancient history. But what I found there was so much more. This is the story of how, in Egypt, I met a man who has something enormous: his heart, his presence, his spirit, and how he became the love of my life. It's a tale of passion, connection, and discovery, set against the breathtaking backdrop of a place unlike any other. What started as a journey to explore a new culture turned into the most profound chapter of my life. What would you do if a single trip changed everything you thought you knew about love? Join me in this unforgettable story about finding love in Egypt, a journey of the heart that will take you from the heights of happiness to the depths of heartbreak. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel, give this video a like, and turn on notifications for more gripping emotion. I still remember the feeling of stepping off the plane in Cairo. The hot, dry air enveloped me immediately, carrying with it the faint scent of spices and the hum of a city alive with history. Egypt wasn't just a destination, it was a dream come true. As a kid growing up in a quiet American suburb, I had always been fascinated by its ancient mysteries, its towering pyramids, and the endless sands of the Sahara. Now, at 22, I was here, ready to explore a world so different from my own. After checking into my small but charming hotel near the bustling heart of Cairo, I ventured out into the city. The streets were a whirlwind of sounds and colors, vendors shouting out their prices in Arabic, the scent of fresh bread from nearby bakeries, and the gleam of golden trinkets in shop windows. It was overwhelming, but in the best way possible. I had one goal that day: to visit Khan el-Khalili, the famous bazaar. I'd heard it was a labyrinth of shops and stalls filled with treasures both ancient and modern. The thought of immersing myself in this cultural hub thrilled me. As I weaved through the narrow alleys, I marveled at the intricate patterns of rugs, the gleaming copper lamps, and the rows of spices that created a kaleidoscope of scents. It was there, amidst the chaos of the market, that I first saw him. He was standing near a stall, speaking with the vendor in Arabic, his voice deep and commanding. Even in the middle of a crowd, he stood out, tall and broad-shouldered, his muscular frame wrapped in a simple white shirt and dark jeans. His tanned skin seemed to glow under the sun, and his jet-black hair, slightly tousled, framed a face so striking it could have been carved from stone. But it was his eyes that caught me. They were dark, piercing, and filled with an intensity that made it impossible to look away. I didn't realize I was staring until he glanced in my direction. Our eyes met for a brief moment, and I felt my heart skip a beat. Embarrassed, I quickly looked down, pretending to examine a nearby stall. But when I glanced back, he was still looking at me, a small, amused smile playing on his lips. Before I could gather the courage to approach him, he turned back to the vendor, paid for his purchase, and walked away, disappearing into the crowd. I stood there, frozen, as if something profound had just happened, but I couldn't quite put it into words. That night, I couldn't stop thinking about him. Who was he? What was it about him that had drawn me in so completely? I told myself it was silly, just a fleeting moment in a busy market, but deep down I knew it was more than that. The next day, I decided to visit the Great Pyramids of Giza. The sun was scorching as I stood in awe of these ancient wonders, their sheer size and history humbling me. Yet, even amidst such grandeur, my mind kept drifting back to him. And then, as if fate had heard my thoughts, I saw him again. He was standing near the Sphinx, his tall frame unmistakable against the backdrop of the ancient statue. This time, I didn't hesitate. I walked toward him, my heart pounding with every step. When I reached him, he turned to face me, his expression curious but kind. "Hello," I said, my voice trembling slightly. He smiled, his eyes softening. "Hello," he replied, his accent adding a musical quality to the word. For a moment, we just stood there, the enormity of the Sphinx behind us and the desert wind swirling around us. It was as if time had slowed down, and in that moment, I felt an inexplicable connection to this stranger. Standing before him, I realized that words were failing me. Up close, his presence was even more magnetic. He had a quiet confidence, the kind that didn't need to announce itself. His dark eyes seemed to hold a world of stories, and when he smiled, it was as if the sun itself had softened. "I saw you at the market yesterday," I blurted out, my nerves betraying me. His smile widened and he nodded. "I remember. You seemed fascinated." My cheeks burned. "Sorry about that. I guess I was just overwhelmed by everything." "I understand," he said, his voice calm and soothing. "The market can be intense, especially for a visitor." I wanted to ask so many questions, but before I could, he extended his hand. "My name is Amir." "James," I said, shaking his hand. His grip was firm yet gentle, and the warmth of his touch lingered even after we let go. We stood there for a moment, the Sphinx towering behind us as tourists moved around, snapping photos and chatting loudly. But for me, the world had shrunk to just the two of us. "Are you here on your own?" he asked, breaking the silence. I nodded. "Yeah, it's my first time in Egypt. I've always wanted to come here, and now that I'm done with college, I thought, why not?" His expression softened, and he tilted his head slightly. "It's a good choice. Egypt has a way of surprising people, of showing them things they never expected." There was something about the way he said it, as if he wasn't just talking about the country but about something deeper. Before I could overthink it, he gestured toward the pyramids. "Have you gone inside yet?" he asked. "No, not yet," I admitted. "I wasn't sure where to start." "I'll show you," he said, a hint of amusement in his tone. "If you don't mind." I couldn't help but smile. I'd like that. As we walked together toward the Great Pyramid, Amir began to share stories about the history of the site, his voice steady and filled with passion. He spoke about the pharaohs, the workers who had built these wonders, and the mysteries that still surrounded them. His knowledge was impressive, but it was the way he spoke, like he was sharing something deeply personal, that captivated me. When we reached the entrance to the pyramid, he stopped and turned to me. "Before you go inside, take a moment. Look at it, feel it. This place has existed for thousands of years, and it has seen everything: love, loss, life, and death. It's a reminder that we are small, but what we leave behind can be enormous." His words struck me in a way I didn't expect. I looked up at the pyramid, its massive stones towering above us, and for the first time, I felt not just awe, but a strange sense of connection. Inside, the air was cool and still, a stark contrast to the blazing heat outside. Amir walked ahead of me, his broad shoulders barely fitting through the narrow passage. The flickering light from our guide's flashlight cast shadows on the ancient walls, and for a moment, it felt like we were the only two people in the world. As we reached the king's chamber, Amir paused and turned to face me. "Do you feel it?" he asked. "Feel what?" "The weight of history," he said softly. "It's like the walls are alive, holding on to everything that's ever happened here." I nodded, though my focus wasn't on the walls. It was on him. There was something about Amir that made me feel like I had known him forever, even though we had just met. Before I could say anything, a group of tourists entered the chamber, their voices breaking the spell. Amir glanced at me and smiled, as if to say, later. We left the pyramid as the sun was beginning to set, painting the desert in hues of gold and orange. Amir offered to show me a small cafe nearby, a place he said served the best mint tea in Cairo. I agreed without hesitation. Sitting across from him in the cozy cafe, I felt a sense of ease I hadn't felt in years. We talked about everything, our families, our dreams, our fears. Amir told me about growing up in Egypt, about how he loved the desert but often dreamed of seeing the world beyond it. As the evening turned into night, I realized I didn't want the day to end. There was something about Amir that drew me in completely, something I couldn't explain. The way Amir looked at me outside the cafe sent a chill through my body. His dark eyes, usually calm and confident, now held something heavier: hesitation, vulnerability. The warm evening breeze carried the faint scent of spices and mint, but the air between us was thick with unspoken words. "What is it?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. He glanced away for a moment, then back at me. "James, you're a good person," he said softly. "I see it in the way you talk, the way you listen. But I need you to understand. My life is complicated." I furrowed my brow, unsure of what he meant. "What do you mean by complicated?" Amir sighed, running a hand through his dark hair. "Egypt is not. It's not like where you're from. People here, they have expectations, rules about how we're supposed to live. And for someone like me," he paused, struggling to find the right words. "For someone like us, it's not easy." It took me a moment to grasp what he was saying, but when I did, my chest tightened. I understood all too well what he meant. In the U.S., I had struggled with the same fears, the same doubts, but I couldn't imagine how much harder it must be for him here. "Amir," I said carefully, "you don't have to explain everything right now. I want to know you, whatever that looks like." For a moment, he looked at me like I had said something unexpected, something he didn't know how to respond to. Then he gave me a small, grateful smile. "Thank you," he said, "but I don't want you to get hurt because of me." His words lingered in my mind as we walked through the dimly lit streets back toward my hotel. The city had a different energy at night, quieter, more intimate. As we passed a small shop selling lanterns, their intricate patterns glowing softly in the dark, I felt a sudden need to break the tension. "You know," I said, trying to lighten the mood, "you're not exactly subtle. You basically rescued me from getting lost twice today." Amir laughed, the sound deep and warm. "Maybe I just wanted an excuse to spend more time with you." His candid response caught me off guard, but it also made me smile. The heaviness between us lifted slightly, and for the rest of the walk, we talked about lighter things: his favorite spots in Cairo, my clumsy attempts at bargaining in the market, and our shared love for ancient history. When we reached the entrance to my hotel, I felt a pang of disappointment. I didn't want the night to end. "Thanks for today," I said, hesitating at the door. Amir nodded, his expression soft. "It's not every day I meet someone like you, James." I wanted to ask what he meant, but before I could, he reached out and touched my shoulder lightly. The gesture was brief, but it sent a jolt through me. "Good night," he said, his voice low and warm. "Good night," I replied, watching as he disappeared into the night. Back in my room, I couldn't stop thinking about him. His smile, the way his eyes softened when he looked at me, the way his words carried both weight and hope. There was something about Amir that felt like gravity, pulling me toward him no matter how much I tried to stay grounded. The next day, Amir surprised me by showing up at my hotel. "I thought we could take a trip," he said, his eyes gleaming with excitement. "Where to?" I asked, already intrigued. "To the desert," he replied. "I want to show you a place I go when I need to clear my head. It's quiet, peaceful, and I think you'll understand why it's special to me." We drove out of the city, the landscape shifting from urban chaos to endless stretches of golden sand. The vastness of the desert was humbling, and as the car came to a stop near a cluster of towering dunes, I felt a sense of awe I couldn't put into words. Amir led me up one of the dunes, the sand soft beneath our feet. When we reached the top, the view took my breath away. The desert stretched out in every direction, glowing under the late afternoon sun. "This is my favorite place," Amir said quietly, sitting down on the sand. "It reminds me that no matter how complicated life gets, there's always beauty to be found." I sat beside him, the silence between us feeling natural, comfortable. For a while, we just watched the sun sink lower in the sky, painting the desert in hues of orange and pink. "Amir," I said finally, breaking the silence, "I don't care how complicated things are. I just know that I want to be here, with you." He turned to look at me, his expression unreadable. Then, slowly, he reached for my hand, his fingers brushing against mine before intertwining them. "I've never felt this way before," he admitted, his voice barely audible. "Me neither," I whispered. In that moment, with the desert wind swirling around us and the last rays of sunlight fading into the horizon, I felt a connection stronger than anything I had ever known. The calmness of the desert evaporated the moment Amir's expression darkened. His eyes, usually warm and inviting, now scanned the horizon with sharp intensity. I felt my heart race as the distant sound of an engine echoed through the dunes. "Who could it be?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. Amir shook his head, his hand still holding mine, steady but firm. "I don't know," he said, his voice low. "But out here, unexpected visitors are rarely good news." The sound grew louder, and soon a faint shape appeared in the distance. A vehicle, its headlights cutting through the encroaching dusk. My stomach knotted as I realized just how exposed we were. There was no one else around, no buildings, no cover, just miles of open desert. Amir stood, his broad frame casting a long shadow in the fading light. "Stay behind me," he said firmly. The car came to a stop a few hundred feet away, and two men stepped out. They were tall, their faces obscured by keffiyehs wrapped tightly around their heads, leaving only their eyes visible. One of them shouted something in Arabic, his tone sharp and demanding. Amir responded, his voice steady but firm, the confidence in his tone unwavering. I couldn't understand the words, but I could sense the tension in the exchange. The men didn't look happy. "What's going on?" I asked nervously, my voice trembling. "They think we're trespassing on their land," Amir said quickly. "But it's more than that. They're looking for something, or someone." The men stepped closer, and I could feel my pulse pounding in my ears. One of them gestured toward me, barking something in Arabic. Amir's posture stiffened. "They're asking why you're here," he said, his jaw tightening. "Just tell them the truth," I whispered, panic creeping into my voice. Amir responded in Arabic, his tone calm but firm. The men exchanged glances, their eyes narrowing as if they didn't believe him. One of them reached into his jacket, and my breath caught in my throat. "James, stay calm," Amir said, his voice low and reassuring. Before I could process what was happening, Amir stepped forward, putting himself between me and the men. His presence was commanding, and for a moment it seemed to work. The men hesitated, lowering their voices as they argued with Amir. But then, one of them made a sudden move, and everything happened too fast. Amir turned to me, his voice urgent. "Run!" I froze, my legs refusing to move. "I'm not leaving you." "Go, James!" he shouted, his voice filled with desperation. Before I could argue further, Amir lunged at the nearest man, grabbing his arm and twisting it away from me. The other man shouted something and charged forward. But Amir was quick, his strength and agility unmatched. I watched, paralyzed, as he fought them off with a ferocity I hadn't seen before. Finally, my instincts kicked in, and I started running down the dune, my feet sinking into the sand with every step. I glanced back just in time to see Amir land a punch that sent one of the men sprawling, but the other quickly recovered, pulling something shiny from his pocket. A knife. "No!" I screamed, my voice tearing through the quiet desert. Amir turned just in time, dodging the first swing, but the second caught him on the side. He staggered, clutching his ribs, but still didn't back down. I wanted to run back to him, to help him, but my body refused to obey. I could only watch, helpless as he fought to protect us both. The sound of a distant engine roared to life again, and I realized the men had a backup plan. The one Amir had knocked down scrambled to his feet and yelled something to the driver, who revved the engine and sped toward us. "James!" Amir shouted, his voice hoarse. "Get to the car, now!" I hesitated for a split second before running toward the vehicle the men had arrived in. Amir had managed to disarm one of them, throwing the knife into the sand, but he was outnumbered and already injured. I reached the car, my hands fumbling as I opened the door. The keys were still in the ignition. "Amir!" I yelled, but he was too far to hear me. Desperation took over. I started the car, my hands shaking as I gripped the steering wheel. In the rearview mirror, I saw Amir still fighting, his movements slower now, but no less determined. "Come on," I whispered to myself, tears blurring my vision. "Come on, Amir." The vehicle's headlights bored down on us like twin suns in the encroaching darkness. My hands gripped the steering wheel of the men's car so tightly that my knuckles turned white. From where I sat, I could see Amir still fighting, his broad frame moving with determination despite the blood staining his shirt from the knife wound. "Amir!" I screamed, my voice cracking, but he didn't look back. The two men were relentless, circling him like predators. One charged forward, but Amir sidestepped, using his strength to shove him into the sand. The second man lunged, catching Amir off guard and knocking him to his knees. Something inside me snapped. I couldn't just sit there and watch. Without thinking, I slammed the car into gear, my foot pressing hard on the accelerator. The engine roared to life, and the tires kicked up sand as I sped toward them. The headlights illuminated the scene in front of me. Amir struggling to stand, the two men closing in on him. They turned at the sound of the car, their eyes wide with shock. I didn't aim to hit them, but the sight of the car barreling toward them was enough to make them scatter. "Get in!" I shouted as I brought the car to a screeching halt beside Amir. He hesitated for only a moment before stumbling toward the passenger side. Blood trickled from the corner of his mouth, and he was clutching his side, but he managed to climb into the car. "Go!" he yelled, his voice strained. I didn't need to be told twice. The tires spun in the sand before finding traction, and the car lurched forward. Behind us, I could see the men scrambling to get back into their own vehicle, their shouts fading as we sped away into the darkness of the desert. For a while, neither of us spoke. The only sounds were the hum of the engine and Amir's labored breathing. My hands shook on the steering wheel, the adrenaline coursing through me refusing to subside. "Are you okay?" I finally asked, my voice barely above a whisper. "I'm fine," Amir said, though his wince told a different story. "Just focus on driving." His words were calm, but when I glanced at him, I saw the blood seeping through his fingers as he pressed against his side. "We need to get you to a hospital," I said, panic rising in my chest. "No hospitals," Amir said firmly. "Not here." "What are you talking about? You're bleeding." He looked at me then, his eyes filled with a mix of pain and urgency. "James, trust me. I'll explain everything, but not now. Just get us somewhere safe." I nodded, swallowing the lump in my throat. Amir's voice carried a weight I couldn't argue with, even if I didn't fully understand. After what felt like an eternity, we reached the outskirts of a small village. Amir directed me to a secluded spot near an abandoned building, his instructions precise despite his obvious pain. I helped him out of the car, draping his arm over my shoulder as we made our way inside. The building was empty, its walls cracked and covered in sand, but it provided shelter from the open desert. "Sit down," I said, easing him onto the floor. Amir groaned as he leaned back against the wall, his face pale but determined. I tore a strip of fabric from my shirt and pressed it against his wound, trying to stem the bleeding. "Why didn't you want to go to a hospital?" I asked, my voice trembling. "Who were those men? Amir, what's going on?" He closed his eyes for a moment, as if gathering his strength. When he opened them, his gaze met mine, steady despite the pain. "They were sent to find me," he said quietly. "Because I broke the rules. Because I'm not living the way they expect me to." I stared at him, the weight of his words sinking in. "You mean because of us?" Amir nodded, his expression bittersweet. "Here, being who I am isn't just frowned upon. It's dangerous. There are people who think it's their duty to enforce the rules, to punish those who don't follow them. And now you're involved." I sat back, my mind reeling. Everything about Amir suddenly made sense. His hesitation, his warnings, the way he carried himself like a man constantly looking over his shoulder. "I'm not leaving you," I said firmly, my voice shaking with emotion. "No matter what happens, we'll figure this out together." Amir's eyes softened, and he reached out, his hand finding mine. "You're braver than I thought, James," he said, his voice low. "But I won't let them hurt you, no matter what." His words carried a finality that sent a chill down my spine. I wanted to argue, to tell him that we were in this together, but before I could speak, the distant sound of an engine shattered the fragile calm. "They're coming," Amir said, his voice tense. "We don't have much time." The engines roared closer, their headlights slicing through the darkness. Amir pulled me close, his hand gripping mine tightly. "Whatever happens, James," he whispered, his voice trembling, "know that you've given me something I thought I'd never have. Love." Before I could respond, the men stormed in. Amir stepped forward to shield me, his tall frame blocking their path. The confrontation turned violent in seconds. Despite his injuries, Amir fought with every ounce of strength he had left. But then, I heard it, a sharp crack that echoed through the room. Amir fell to his knees, clutching his chest, his eyes meeting mine one last time. "No!" I screamed, rushing to him. His hand weakly grasped mine as his voice faded. "Live for me," he whispered, before the light in his eyes dimmed forever. This is how I lost the love of my life in the sands of Egypt. His courage and love will stay with me forever, a reminder that even the briefest of connections can change us profoundly. What would you do for love? Would you risk everything, knowing it might end in heartbreak? Share your thoughts below. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on notifications to join me for more stories of love, loss, and resilience.